This is a quick demonstration on dye stone from the plaster guys. So if you go to eBay and you type in dye stone on eBay, and the plaster guys will come up. For an average size mold for this particular product, I'm using 1 3/4 or 1.75 ounces of water for an average mold. An average mold being a mold like number 50 Wizard's Tower mold. I'm going to be doing the mold number 70 here, and this seems to be just about enough material for a mold number 70. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sprinkling the powder into the water. Let's move this aside here. And we will start sprinkling in. And I always pretty much mix my eye. I start sprinkling in, it will soak in, and sprinkle it, and it will soak in. And if there's any lakes of water on the side, go ahead and try to sprinkle onto those lakes of water. Okay, so I've got a mounded dry plaster on top, a little bit of one, but it looks like it's starting to soak into the sides. Let's tap it just a little bit. I think we're getting pretty close there. I think we're getting pretty close because I've got a sort of a mounded dry plaster on it, but there's also around the sides, you can see that there's a little bit of water. I think that's a pretty close mix by eye. Let's see how many ounces we did. If we look at it, we're looking at right about 3.5 ounces, which is pretty much exactly the same amount that we had for the Excalibur mix. Okay, so that's about the right amount of powder. I'm just going to go just a little bit more when I see kind of the lake around the side there. But 1 3/4 ounces of water to about 3.5. So it's pretty much 50 or 200%. In other words, if you had 2 ounces of water, then you'd fill it up till you get about 4 ounces of material. If you had 3 ounces of water, you'd fill it up until you get about 6 ounces of material. Now, as I'm mixing this up, and you can kind of see this mixing in the cup, this does not mix as thin as Merlin's Magic or Excalibur. It's a little bit thicker, and it feels, or it seems like it's got a little more texture to it. This feels a little more like plaster of Paris when you're stirring it, but it's definitely smoother and it definitely flows better than regular plaster of Paris would. So let's go ahead and get this material in the mold. I'm going to go ahead and take this mold here, and I'm going to spray the surfactant on it, and we'll just knock out any excess. And we are going to go ahead and pour this in. Now let's take a look as this stuff pours in here. As it pours, it kind of flows. It definitely flows better than plaster of Paris, but it does not flow quite as well as Merlin's Magic or the Excalibur. It's almost like this material is just a slight bit more coarse. So let's just pour it in. And you know we're getting a ton of air bubbles under there. You know we're getting a lot of air bubbles. So at this point, after I've poured it in, I'm going to set the book that I've got this resting on to the edge of the table, and I'm going to use the handle of a screwdriver, and I'm going to tap the bottom of the mold. And you can see all those air bubbles, you know, pretty much coming to the top. And this does have a flow to it. There is an additive they added to this to make it flow. But it looks like we're going to need just a little bit more material. And I might have to get a spoon and get that out of the cup. There it goes. Get that out of there. That's just about the right amount. Just about the right amount of material for that. Okay, let's just tap it again. Get a few more air bubbles out of there. And that one's ready to let it set up a minute. Now for this dye stone, I am only going to let it set up for 5 minutes. If for some reason it seems to want to thicken up just a little bit quicker. In other words, it's not as much of a flow stone. There's not as much material that makes it thixotropic. So when this thing sets up for 5 minutes, when you scrape it, I think it'll scrape really nice. Okay, our 5 minutes are about up here. There we go. So that was our 5 minutes. Now I did notice when looking at this after it has set for 5 minutes, the material does not seem to sink down into the mold like the Excalibur did. It seems to stay mixed pretty well. There's not really a layer of water that comes to the top and have your brick short. One way that, to check to see if it's thickened up, if you can take and kind of scrape it like that, and it actually comes clean, it doesn't flow back down and try to cover the hole up again, then you know that this is probably just about right for scraping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to lightly scrape across to see if any water comes off. And there is a little bit of layer of water. You see, I don't know if you can see that coming off the knife. There was actually a layer of water that came to the top. So I'll scrape that off first. Then what I'm going to do is you'll notice it's a little bit thick. When you scrape it, you get a little bit of resistance. So what I do is I kind of take the knife and I kind of do a zigzaggy motion across it to kind of break up any of the, if it's a little bit solid across the top there. So I'm going to go across it like that and break it up. And I notice the texture is just a little bit rougher than the Merlin's Magic and the Excalibur. It's almost like when it's ground up, it's not quite as fine a powder when it's ground up. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it just seems a little grainier as I'm going over. So I'm going to lay the knife down, and I'm just going to go across it at an angle like this. Okay? I scrape across it, and that scraped really nice. Now, a lot of times what I do is I go back the other way, because sometimes when you scrape across it, you pull the material out of the mold, and so it kind of humps up on this side, but kind of recesses down on the other side. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and I'm just going to lay the knife across and scrape across it. And I don't know if you can sort of see the texture on the back of the blocks there. It almost looks a little rough on the back of it. Let's see if I can zoom that in just a little bit here. Let's see. Okay, we're zooming in there. I'm just going to put a little bit more material back in the mold there. And when you scrape over it, as you scrape over the top, it looks a little rough and then it kind of smooths out again. Now that's a really nice flat scrape. That's a better scrape than I was able to get with the Merlin's Magic or the Excalibur. Keep in mind that this die stone is 14,000 psi compression strength. So it's not as strong as the Excalibur, not that you'd notice any difference. And it's about the same compression strength as the Merlin's Magic. Okay, it's been 20 minutes since we scraped it, so it's really been a total of 25 minutes since we first poured this material in. Let's see how the blocks come out. Looking at the top, it looks like these are probably the smoothest or flattest blocks that I've gotten so far. Since it's not really a flow stone, it sets up thicker so you can actually scrape it a lot flatter. These are how the blocks come out. Now this is just with my, pounding it on the board. And I'm not really seeing any bubbles at all on the side of there. So that's kind of how this casting came out. Now I do have to say that if you are using this die stone material for something like the inn accessories or for the cavern accessories, something that you've got fine pieces, bottles, books, that sort of thing, I would strongly recommend that you use a vibrating table of some sort. I don't think you're going to be able to get this material down into the really thin, fine, difficult pieces unless you use a vibrating table. Otherwise, I think this material is just fine. Keep in mind, this die stone is not as strong as the Excalibur, but I did find that it was really fairly easier to scrape and to get nice flat surface on the top of the mold.